The inheritance Johnny Johns received on his 28th birthday came with a corner office, 17 armed bodyguards, and a to-do list that started with Find Dad's Killer and ended with launder 3 billion credits through the Neptune casinos. Johnny had been managing a protein bar on Ganymede when the lawyers found him. They wore suits that cost more than his annual salary and spoke in the clipped, efficient manner of people who billed by the minute. His father, Victor Johns, had died in what the news feeds called a shuttle malfunction near the asteroid belt. What the lawyers called it in much quieter tones was an assassination. The trip back to Earth happened in a blur. Johnny spent most of it staring at documents he couldn't understand, nodding at appropriate moments while his brain screamed that there had been some terrible mistake. His father sold industrial cleaning supplies. Johnny had attended exactly 4 company barbecues growing up, all of which featured disappointing hot dogs and his dad's coworkers discussing pH levels. The penthouse in New Singapore told a different story. Johnny stepped off the private elevator into a space that looked like someone had asked an architect to design intimidation itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city's glittering sprawl. Actual earth-grown plants lined the walls, their leaves so green they seemed fake. 3 people waited for him in the seating area, each one studying him with the focus of predators evaluating prey. The woman who stood first had silver cybernetic implants running up both arms, intricate patterns that caught the light when she moved. She didn't extend her hand. Instead, she gave a slight nod that somehow conveyed both respect and reservation. Her name was Catherine Voss, and she'd been Victor's head of operations for 12 years. The man to her left, built like a loading mech and sporting a jaw that could probably deflect small-caliber rounds, went by Tommy Riggs. He handled enforcement. The third person, rail-thin with eyes that never quite focused on anything directly, introduced himself as Felix Zhao, information specialist. They waited for Johnny to speak. He cleared his throat, buying time by pretending to survey the room. His father's desk dominated one corner, its surface empty except for a small photo frame. Johnny recognized the picture, himself at graduation, grinning like an idiot, his father's arm around his shoulders. Catherine broke the silence first, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone delivering a weather report. Victor had built the syndicate over 30 years, she explained. They ran protection services for off-world shipping lanes, managed several entertainment establishments of questionable legality, and maintained what she called aggressive market positions in various pharmaceutical distribution networks. Johnny's brain translated this as, "Holy shit, my dad was a crime lord." Tommy wanted to know what Johnny's plan was. The other families would be watching, testing, seeing if Victor's son had inherited his father's steel spine or if he'd crack under pressure. They needed to hit back hard and make an example. Johnny's mouth went dry. These people thought he'd been training for this. His father had apparently spent years telling them stories about Johnny's off-world business ventures, his natural instinct for strategy, his careful study of the family operations. None of it was true. The closest Johnny had come to criminal enterprise was that time he'd accidentally kept a library book for 3 years. But they were all looking at him with something like hope mixed with desperation, and the words came out before he could stop them. "I need time to assess the situation. Rushing in would be exactly what our enemies want. We need to be smart about this, strategic." His father had taught him that patience was a weapon. Catherine's posture shifted slightly, her shoulders dropping half an inch. "Good," she said. Victor had always preached the long game. Johnny had absolutely no game whatsoever, long or otherwise. But he was committed now, standing in his dead father's office, lying his face off to people who could probably dispose of his body in 18 different untraceable ways. The first crisis hit during Johnny's second day of pretending to be a criminal mastermind. Catherine burst into the office looking unusually ruffled, which Johnny had learned meant something catastrophic had happened. Someone had hit one of their shipments coming in from Titan, she reported. 3 crew members dead, 5 million credits worth of synthetic stimulants gone. The room went silent. Tommy cracked his knuckles, a sound like gunshots. Felix pulled up holographic displays showing shipping routes and timestamps. They all turned to Johnny. His mind raced through every crime movie he'd ever seen, discarding options as quickly as they appeared. He couldn't order anyone killed. He didn't know how to give the kill order. He wasn't even sure what synthetic stimulants were, though he assumed they weren't the good kind you got at the pharmacy. Johnny walked to the windows, hands clasped behind his back in what he hoped looked like thoughtful contemplation rather than barely controlled panic. The city sprawled below, millions of people who probably weren't accidentally running a crime organization they'd inherited from a father they thought sold cleaning supplies. What would his father do? Johnny wondered. Then he remembered the man who taught him to ride a bike, who'd attended every school play despite clearly being bored out of his mind, who'd once spent 3 hours helping Johnny build a model rocket that immediately crashed. That man had also, apparently, ordered hits on rival gang members and laundered enough money to destabilize small planetary economies. The cognitive dissonance made his head hurt. Johnny turned back to face his waiting lieutenants, using every ounce of confidence he'd ever faked during protein bar sales presentations. They wouldn't retaliate yet, he announced. Whoever hit them wanted a reaction, wanted them off balance. Instead, they'd send a message of a different sort. Business as usual. No panic, no fear. Increase security on the remaining shipments, but make it subtle. Let their enemies wonder why they weren't scared. Catherine tilted her head slightly, considering. Felix nodded slowly. Tommy looked disappointed, but accepting. It was possibly the dumbest strategy Johnny had ever conceived, but they were buying it. The next week brought a cascade of minor disasters that Johnny handled with increasingly creative applications of complete ignorance. A turf dispute in the dock district got resolved when Johnny suggested they simply give the contested territory to a neutral third party, turning two enemies into confused allies united by their shared bewilderment. A corrupt station inspector demanding higher bribes found himself suddenly promoted to a position that technically gave him oversight of his own previous job, creating a bureaucratic paradox that kept him too busy to bother anyone. Johnny was winging it so hard he could have flown to Mars, but people kept treating his random flailing as genius-level strategy. Catherine started taking detailed notes during meetings. Tommy began prefacing suggestions with what he thought Johnny's father would have done, always coming to the conclusion that Johnny's approach was even cleverer. Felix developed an entire conspiracy board trying to map out Johnny's supposed master plan. The pressure built like a reactor heading toward critical. Johnny spent his nights researching everything he could about his father's operations, trying to match the man in the photos to the criminal empire he'd built. He found encrypted files, transaction records that read like fiction, surveillance footage of meetings his father had taken in shadowy restaurants and converted warehouses. In one clip, Victor Johns sat across from a person whose face was deliberately pixelated, and even through the distortion, Johnny could see the tension in every line of his father's body. His dad had lived a completely separate life. The realization hurt more than Johnny wanted to admit. The break in the case came from Felix, who'd been methodically tracking every possible lead on Victor's death. He'd found an anomaly in the shuttle's maintenance records. Someone had accessed the system 3 days before the incident, someone with high-level clearance within the syndicate itself. The conference room felt smaller suddenly. Catherine's expression went cold and hard. Tommy's hands curled into fists. Felix kept his gaze locked on his displays as if the data could protect him from the implications. They had a traitor. Johnny's stomach dropped. This was beyond his ability to fake his way through. This was life and death, loyalty and betrayal, the kind of situation that required actual knowledge of how criminal organizations functioned. He needed to say something, but his mind had gone completely blank. Catherine spoke into the silence, her voice carrying an edge Johnny hadn't heard before. They'd need to move carefully, she said. Whoever the traitor was, they had access to sensitive information. One wrong move and they'd spook them, or worse, trigger a wider conspiracy. Johnny grabbed onto the lifeline she'd inadvertently thrown him. Exactly right, he said, forcing his voice to stay level. They'd continue as if they suspected nothing. Business as usual, but Felix would dig deeper quietly. Catherine would subtly test the loyalty of key personnel. Tommy would watch for any unusual movements. And Johnny would try not to vomit from stress. The syndicate's response to Victor's death had drawn attention from other families. Invitations arrived for meetings, thinly veiled as condolence calls. Johnny found himself sitting across from people whose names appeared in law enforcement databases under multiple aliases, making small talk about market conditions while they studied him for weakness. He met Rita Blackwell, who controlled most of the gambling operations in the belt and smiled like a shark scenting blood. He shook hands with David Santos, whose legitimate shipping business supposedly moved more contraband than legal cargo. He endured a 3-hour dinner with the Yang brothers, who spoke in perfect unison and never blinked at the same time, which was somehow more disturbing than anything else he'd experienced. They all wanted to know the same thing. Was Johnny Johns his father's son, or was the syndicate about to become available for acquisition? Johnny channeled every ounce of fake confidence he possessed, nodding at appropriate moments, laughing at jokes he didn't understand, making vague statements about the future that could be interpreted a dozen different ways. He was a one-man improv show, and the audience was armed. Felix cracked the case on a Tuesday, which Johnny would later reflect was entirely too mundane of a day for his world to explode. The traitor was Catherine. The evidence was irrefutable. She'd accessed the shuttle systems, using credentials stolen from maintenance personnel. She'd been in contact with Rita Blackwell's people for 6 months. She'd been systematically feeding information to their rivals, positioning herself to jump ship when the syndicate collapsed under the weight of Victor's death. Felix presented his findings in the office, just the two of them. Johnny felt his hands start shaking and shoved them in his pockets. Catherine Voss, who'd been helping him navigate this impossible situation, who'd covered for his mistakes and interpreted his random nonsense as strategy, had killed his father. The rage hit him like a physical thing, hot and overwhelming, but right behind it came the fear. What did he do now? Confront her. Run. Call the actual police and explain that his criminal syndicate had an internal murder problem. Felix watched him carefully, waiting for orders. Johnny's brain spun through scenarios, each one ending in disaster. Catherine was smart, connected, dangerous. She probably had contingency plans for getting caught. She definitely had more experience with this kind of thing than Johnny's zero experience. But she'd killed his dad. The man who taught him to ride a bike and built model rockets, and apparently run a massive criminal empire while keeping his son completely in the dark, because he'd wanted better for him. Johnny made a decision based purely on emotion and desperation, which later he'd realize was actually the first genuine crime lord move he'd made. They'd turn the tables, he told Felix. They'd feed Catherine false information, make her think she was still undiscovered, and they'd use her to get to Rita Blackwell. Felix's expression shifted to something like respect. The plan came together with terrifying speed. Johnny fed Catherine a story about a major shipment coming through the Ganymede station. High value, light security. He made it believable, dropping hints over several days, letting her think she'd pieced it together herself. Felix monitored her communications, watching as she passed the information along to Rita's network. The trap was set, except Johnny hadn't actually planned what happened after the trap. He'd been so focused on the mechanics of the deception that he'd forgotten the part where he'd need to actually confront armed criminals who were expecting a shipment, and would instead find an ambush. This oversight occurred to him while standing in a cargo bay on Ganymede Station, watching Rita Blackwell's people arrive in force. Tommy and his enforcement crew were positioned throughout the facility. Catherine stood beside Johnny, playing her role perfectly, unaware that Felix had routed all her communications through dummy channels and fed them exactly what they wanted her to see. Rita herself appeared, flanked by security that looked military-grade. She scanned the empty cargo bay with cold calculation, and Johnny watched her face as she realized the setup. Her hand moved toward her weapon. Catherine's eyes widened in genuine confusion, looking between Johnny and Rita. Tommy's people moved in, a coordinated operation that suggested they'd done this before. Rita's security responded, and the cargo bay erupted into chaos. Johnny hit the deck behind a shipping container, his heart trying to punch through his ribs. Energy weapons lit up the space in flickering blue-white light. Someone screamed. Something exploded behind him, showering the area in sparks and debris fragments. Catherine materialized beside his hiding spot, her weapon drawn, her expression thunderous. She'd figured it out. Johnny pressed himself against the container, very aware that he had no weapon, no backup plan, and no idea what he was doing. She aimed her weapon at his head. Johnny did the only thing he could think of. He started talking. He told her he knew everything. He told her about Felix's investigation, about the communications they'd intercepted, about how they'd been feeding her false information for days. He told her about finding the photo of his father on the desk, about not understanding how the same man who'd helped him with homework could have built this empire. He told her he had no idea what he was doing, that he'd been faking it the entire time, that he was probably the worst crime lord in human history. Catherine stared at him, weapon steady, her finger on the trigger. The firefight continued around them, muffled by the shipping container and the ringing in Johnny's ears. Then she started laughing. It was not a reassuring sound. She told him she'd known from the first day. Victor had confided in her before he died, told her he was worried about bringing Johnny into the life, about whether his son could handle it. She'd killed Victor because he'd been planning to dismantle the syndicate, to go legitimate, to rob her of everything she'd built alongside him. She thought Johnny would be easy to manipulate, to control, to eventually dispose of. But the kid had surprised her. He'd actually shown potential, made decisions that worked despite being completely unorthodox. She'd started to think maybe Victor had been right about his son after all. Of course, now she was going to kill him anyway. Nothing personal. Johnny closed his eyes, waiting for the shot. Instead, he heard Tommy's voice, calm and close. Catherine's weapon clattered to the deck. Johnny opened his eyes to find Tommy standing over Catherine's unconscious form, a stun weapon in his massive hand. He'd been listening the whole time, Tommy explained. Everyone had, actually. Felix had kept Johnny's communication line open. The entire enforcement team had heard Johnny's confession about faking everything. Johnny's stomach sank. This was it. They'd realize he was a fraud and probably space him. Tommy extended his hand, helping Johnny to his feet. The big man's expression was hard to read, but there might have been something like amusement in his eyes. Victor had been the same way when he started, Tommy said. Made it up as he went along, trusted his instincts, somehow made it work. The old man had always said the best leaders were the ones who knew what they didn't know. Rita Blackwell surrendered once her security team was neutralized, calculating that living to fight another day beat dying in a cargo bay on Ganymede. She sat across from Johnny in an interrogation room, studying him with renewed interest. She'd underestimated him, she admitted. He'd played the long game better than she'd expected. Johnny didn't correct her. He was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear, but he met her gaze and kept his expression neutral. Felix had coached him on what to say, but in the end, Johnny went with his gut. He offered her a deal, complete withdrawal from several contested territories, reparations for the shipment she'd stolen, and her full cooperation in identifying everyone Catherine had been working with. In exchange, she lived and kept her primary operations. It was probably too generous. Johnny could see Rita thinking the same thing, trying to figure the angle. But she agreed because sometimes in this business, survival was the real victory. Catherine's trial happened internally because apparently crime syndicates had their own justice systems. Johnny didn't attend. He couldn't stomach watching, even knowing what she'd done. Tommy reported that she'd accepted her sentence with the same calculating calm she'd shown throughout her betrayal. She'd rolled the dice and lost. That was the game. Johnny spent a week sorting through the aftermath, with Felix and Tommy guiding him through the necessary steps. They restructured security protocols, vetted personnel, reached out to contacts to stabilize relationships. Slowly, the syndicate found its balance. The other families sent carefully worded messages. Johnny had proven himself. Rita's capture and Catherine's exposure had sent a message about competence and ruthlessness. That Johnny had accomplished it while having no idea what he was doing remained his secret. Mostly his secret. Tommy definitely knew. Felix probably suspected. But they kept it to themselves, treating Johnny with a respect that felt increasingly genuine rather than obligatory. 3 months after inheriting the syndicate, Johnny sat in his father's office now, and actually understood most of the reports he was reading. Felix had been teaching him the information networks, how to read between the lines of seemingly innocent communications. Tommy had been walking him through enforcement protocols, though Johnny had made it clear he preferred solutions that didn't involve violence when possible. Catherine's replacement, a pragmatic woman named Angela Torres, had been showing him the financial systems that kept everything running. He still felt like he was making it up as he went along, but he'd learned that everyone felt that way, even his father. Especially his father, who'd built an empire while trying to protect his son from the truth of what he'd become. Johnny had found a letter buried in his father's personal files. Victor had written it a week before his death, never sent, maybe never intended to send. It explained everything, the double life, the lies, the desperate hope that Johnny could have a normal existence. It apologized for the inheritance, for the burden, for the choices Victor had made that led to this moment. It ended with a single line, "You'll figure it out because you're smarter than me." Johnny wasn't sure about that, but he was trying. The protein bar on Ganymede had new management now, someone who actually knew how to run a legitimate business. Johnny had other responsibilities. He attended meetings with people who discussed territory disputes and market manipulation. He made decisions that affected thousands of people across the solar system. He signed documents that would have sent his younger self running for the authorities. But he also implemented profit-sharing for the lower-level employees because his father's empire had made billions, and the people doing the actual work deserved better than subsistence wages. He created an exit program for anyone who wanted out of the life, funded education and relocation, offered second chances. He refused hits on civilians and cut ties with operations that trafficked in genuine harm rather than simple illegality. Some of the old guard grumbled, most adapted. The syndicate's profits didn't suffer. Johnny's reputation grew as someone who honored the old codes while writing new ones. He still had no idea what he was doing most days. But he'd learned that confidence was just fear wearing a better suit, that leadership was mostly listening, and occasionally making the least bad choice available, and that his father had been both the man who built model rockets and the man who built a criminal empire. People were complicated, life was messy, and sometimes the best you could do was fake it until you made it. Johnny Johns had inherited a crime syndicate on his 28th birthday, and against all odds, he was making it work. His father would have been proud, confused, and probably horrified in equal measure, but mostly proud. The city glittered outside his windows, full of people living their complicated lives. Somewhere out there, someone else was probably discovering an unexpected inheritance, a secret identity, a truth that rewrote everything they thought they knew. Johnny hoped they handled it better than he had, but he suspected they'd probably just make it up as they went along, same as everyone else. The intercom buzzed. Angela's voice announced his next appointment. A representative from the Mars colonies wanted to discuss partnership opportunities. Johnny straightened his tie, put on his most confident expression, and prepared to have absolutely no idea what he was doing. But hey, it was getting easier every day.